My name is Genevieve Carter. I'm 43 years old. For the majority of my life, I served as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I've endured combat zones, lost people I considered family, and carried secrets I'll never speak aloud. But nothing, not a single thing, could have prepared me for the moment my own brother rose to his feet in that courtroom, pointed directly at me, and screamed, "She's just a fake veteran." Those words rang through my skull like a rifle shot. I remember the sudden hush that fell over the room, the collective intake of breath, the bewilderment, the revulsion. I could feel every gaze in that space cutting through me, dismantling decades of dedication, sacrifice, and honor in an instant. But I didn't waver. I didn't weep. I simply reached into my briefcase and withdrew the slim tan folder I had been holding onto for nearly 2 years. My fingers barely shook. I stood, stepped forward, and set it down quietly on the judge's desk. He turned to the first page, and then the world seemed to halt. The judge's expression darkened. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, yet every syllable reached me as clearly as if it had been amplified. "No one move. Close the doors now." Military police in crisp uniforms with heavy boots marched into the courtroom. Douglas's attorney, the same man who had sneered at me only minutes before, let every document in his grip fall to the floor. The color left his face entirely. Douglas, my brother, stumbled back. My mother's lips parted, but she produced no sound. My family sat ghostly, trapped, and exposed. In that moment, I wasn't the disgrace they had made me out to be. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the woman who had returned home, not to plead, not to justify myself, but to put an end to the lies they had been spinning behind my back for years. And I understood, deep in my core, that this was only the beginning. I hadn't always imagined life would lead me here. Before the lawsuits, before the betrayal, before the courtroom, there was simply me, the sea, and an old weathered house. My father had left behind a home perched on the cliffs of Monterey Bay. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I can still hear the waves breaking against the rocks, the salt carried on the air, and my father's voice from long before I shipped out on my first deployment. Some things, EV, you have to protect no matter the cost. I had believed him. I had built my life around those words. I spent 20 years abroad watching the world come apart and stitching myself back together with borrowed strength. When I came home, I expected no celebration. I needed no gratitude. I wanted only one thing, to belong somewhere again. But home was no longer what I remembered. My father was gone. The man who had once held everything together had left behind a will, a modest one really, dividing his humble estate among his 3 children. I was left the house I had always loved. Douglas, my older brother, assumed control of the family business. Mason, my youngest brother, remained largely quiet, the eternal observer. For a brief stretch of weeks, I thought that might be enough. I thought perhaps we could begin anew. Then the envelope arrived. A thick, dense packet of legal papers, and with it, a betrayal I had never anticipated. I sat at my kitchen table, hands resting on the cold marble surface as I read every line of the lawsuit. Douglas and my mother, my own flesh and blood, had accused me of fraud. They claimed I had never truly served, that I had fabricated my military records to curry favor in our father's will. Worse still, they alleged I had defrauded the government by claiming benefits meant for genuine veterans. The sheer audacity of it made my stomach turn. 20 years of service. Shrapnel still lodged in my shoulder. Nights I couldn't get through without waking in a cold sweat. None of it mattered. Not to them. The court summons was unambiguous. I had 30 days to appear. I remember looking across the table at Mason. His eyes slid away from mine, as they so often did. He had always been the quiet one, the peacemaker, yet something flickered behind his gaze. Hesitation, perhaps, or sorrow, or guilt. I couldn't say. He offered nothing in words, and I understood I would face this alone. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation and numbness. I assembled every piece of evidence I could find, every official record, every medal, every photograph. But more than anything, I braced myself for what I knew would cut deepest. The understanding that my family had chosen greed over kinship. I had fought for my country. Now I would have to fight for my name. The courtroom was colder than I had anticipated, not in temperature, but in feeling. The air was thin, the lights too harsh, the faces too many. I sat upright in a dark navy dress suit. No uniform, no medals, just Genevieve Carter, the woman they were determined to destroy. Douglas sat to my right. My mother clung to his arm, her expression hard as carved stone. Mason, as ever, sat on the periphery, eyes lowered, barely drawing breath. The moment arrived sooner than I expected. Douglas stood and, with a venom I had never before heard from him, he spoke the words that would engrave themselves forever in my memory. "She's just a fake veteran." Gasps swept through the room. Heads turned, but I kept my expression still. My hands did not tremble. I knew this was the point of no return. The judge called for evidence. Douglas's lawyer presented altered documents, distorted timelines, and fabricated narratives. Every word, every glance, every accusation was designed to strip me bare, not merely in legal terms, but personally to obliterate who I was. When my turn came, I said nothing. Not immediately. Instead, I reached for the file, the one Mason had quietly pressed into my hands just days prior, containing every piece of truth they had believed I'd never uncover. I walked forward. I placed it on the judge's desk, and I waited. What followed would change everything. But in that moment, I was simply a soldier once more. Calm, composed, unbroken. I was never the daughter they wanted. From as far back as I can recall, I was different. Not defiant, not disruptive, just different. While Douglas was groomed to inherit the family enterprise and Mason, the youngest, was sheltered into passivity, I floated somewhere between restless and invisible. My parents had built their lives around Carter and Sons Holdings, a collection of boutique hotels that defined not only our wealth, but our identity. Every meal, every holiday, every decision orbited the business. Even as a child, I could sense the unspoken rule. Loyalty to the family meant loyalty to the business. But I didn't fit. I had no interest in quarterly earnings or client portfolios. I cared about courage and justice and freedom, the things I discovered in dusty library books while the others studied profit margins. I remember once, around age 10, my father found me reading a biography of Harriet Tubman. He smiled, sat beside me, and said, "One day you'll find something worth fighting for." But my mother didn't smile. She always looked at me as though I were an unfinished puzzle she couldn't solve. Douglas thrived beneath their attention. He learned early how to charm them, how to mirror their ambitions. I watched from the margins as he became the golden child, always right, always praised. Mason was a different matter entirely. He was gentle, reserved. He took refuge in corners with his books as I did, but unlike me, he never defied them. I protected Mason as best I could. I remember covering for him when he skipped sports practice or forgot his homework. There was a softness to him that I recognized because it was the part of me I had been forced to bury just to survive in that house. But despite the delicate bond Mason and I shared, the truth was stark. In that family, love was conditional, and the condition was obedience. When I first mentioned joining the Army, it wasn't a conversation. It was a battle. My mother wept. Douglas scoffed. Even Mason looked away. But I left regardless. At 18, with nothing but a duffel bag and my father's final words ringing in my ears, I walked out. None of them followed. War changes a person. Anyone who tells you otherwise never truly went to war. I spent the next 2 decades of my life in uniform, serving in places most people couldn't locate on a map. I rose through the ranks. I led men and women into situations where we all understood we might not return. And sometimes we didn't. My first deployment to Afghanistan was the first time I felt genuinely alive. The desert heat, the weight of body armor, the drone of helicopters overhead, all carved something sharp and solid within me. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter who didn't belong. I was Lieutenant Carter. I mattered, but belonging came with loss. I remember every face I couldn't save, every letter I wrote to families who would never hold their loved ones again. The blast that ripped through my convoy left me with shrapnel buried in my shoulder, nerve damage that never fully healed, and nightmares that appear without invitation. Honor and duty carried me through, but they left their marks, some visible, most invisible. And still I never resented those years, because I knew exactly who I was when I wore that uniform. I earned every medal, every salute, every fold in the flag handed to grieving families. When I finally returned home, older and quieter and harder, I carried those years inside me. I wasn't naive enough to expect my family to comprehend what I had been through, but I thought, foolishly perhaps, that they might at least respect it. They didn't. At family dinners, Douglas changed the subject whenever my service came up. My mother looked elsewhere. Mason stayed silent as always. It became apparent that to them, my years in uniform weren't a mark of honor, but an inconvenient detour from the path they had expected me to follow. But I carried no regrets because the military had taught me something that would one day rescue me. That battles are not always fought with weapons, but with endurance. And that survival, in the end, is the ultimate act of defiance. When my father died, everything changed and everything remained the same. He passed quietly in his sleep in the very house I would one day fight to keep. There was no drama, no final words of significance, just absence. The funeral was polished and proper. Suited acquaintances whispered condolences to a family that appeared whole only from the outside. I stood beside Douglas and Mason as the casket was lowered. I could almost hear my father's voice. Some things, Evie, you have to protect. The reading of the will came 2 weeks later. I hadn't expected much. After all, I had been the estranged daughter, the soldier who had disappeared. But when the lawyer announced that my father had left me the Monterey house, the family's oldest property, the tension in the room became tangible. Douglas's jaw went tight. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Mason said nothing as always, but I noticed his eyes, wider than usual, shifting between us. The house wasn't worth millions, but it carried meaning. It was history, memory, roots. Douglas inherited the business as expected. Mason received a trust fund. I received a home. And for a brief moment, I believed that perhaps, just perhaps, we could move forward. But greed has deep roots. Less than a month later, the first legal notice arrived. They claimed I had manipulated our father, that my military service was fabricated, that I had stolen valor, and by extension, tainted the will. They demanded the house, the inheritance of my silence. I was stunned. Not because they wanted more. I had always known Douglas's appetite for control, but because they were willing to erase everything I was in order to obtain it. The betrayal wasn't in the lawsuit itself. It was in the faces of the people who should have stood beside me and had instead chosen to bury me. I understood then that the real war had only just begun. The moment the lawsuit became public, my life transformed overnight. It started with whispers. Then came the headlines. Online blogs, tabloids, even local news. Decorated soldier or master fraud. The Genevieve Carter scandal. I remember staring at my own photographs splashed across screens, the word fraud in bold beneath them. My phone rang constantly. Reporters, distant relatives, old acquaintances from years gone by, all either demanding explanations or quietly withdrawing. I became a ghost in my own town. The local cafe where I used to pick up my morning coffee. The barista stopped making eye contact. Neighbors I had known for years now crossed the street to avoid me. I could read it in their expressions. Doubt, suspicion, judgment. The deepest wounds, though, came from those I had once called friends. Some sent polite but distant messages, thinking of you, while others vanished without a word. Invitations stopped coming. Smiles faded. Even the Veterans Association I belonged to hesitated before reaching out, and only to request clarification on my status. The isolation pressed down heavier than any deployment I had endured. Douglas and my mother pressed forward without pause. Their legal team was relentless, feeding stories to the media, leaking falsified documents, bending half-truths into damning narratives. They cast me not only as a fraud, but as an ungrateful daughter, a disgrace to both family and country. Every time I saw my mother's face on television, speaking calmly of her concern for my well-being, I felt the same sick churn in my stomach. How effortlessly she smiled for the cameras while driving a knife into my back. And Mason, he stayed silent. Or so I believed. The worst part wasn't the legal fight itself. It was the gnawing fear that perhaps people would believe them. That the years I had poured into serving my country, the sacrifices, the scars, the memories, none of it would matter if the world chose to tell a different story. I began to doubt myself. I felt unmoored. I would wake at night, soaked in sweat, the boundary between battlefield nightmares and this new war dissolving entirely. But somewhere in that darkness, something within me hardened. I was not going to let them win. Not like this. I understood I couldn't fight this battle on emotion alone. I needed to find the truth. The real truth concealed beneath years of family secrets and carefully constructed deceptions. The first clue arrived unexpectedly. A text message from Mason. 5 words. We need to talk alone. I met him late one evening at the same cliffs where our father had taken us as children. The wind was cold. The sea roared below. Mason stood there with his arms folded, visibly agitated. He had aged since the last time I had truly looked at him. Lines had deepened across his forehead, but his eyes were unchanged, soft and troubled and distant. I never wanted this, he said quietly. I didn't know how far they'd go. He extended a small flash drive toward me. No explanation, no promises. Just, I thought you should see this. Back home, I plugged it in with hands that barely held steady. What I found left me breathless. Emails exchanged between Douglas and our mother, sent months before our father's death, discussing alterations to his will. Financial records showing funds transferred into offshore accounts. Accounts linked to veteran charities I had never known Douglas was connected to. They had used my name, my service, my image to construct a fraudulent paper trail that served them while making me the scapegoat. There were even draft press releases accusing me of stolen valor, written months before I had any awareness that a problem existed. I sat motionless, crushed by the weight of the betrayal. But what cut the deepest wasn't the scheme itself. It was Mason, the boy I had shielded, the one I thought I had permanently lost to the family machine. He had chosen, finally and painfully, to do the right thing. And that left me with a choice of my own. I could take this evidence and reduce them to rubble, or I could find a way to win without becoming who they were. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I drafted my strategy carefully and methodically, letting every shred of heartbreak fuel my resolve. They believed they knew me. They thought I would crack. But they had forgotten something. Soldiers don't surrender. The following morning, I stood before my mirror for a long time. The face looking back wasn't the young woman who had left for basic training at 18. It wasn't the soldier who had survived IED blasts and desert ambushes. It wasn't the woman who had wept upon receiving her first commendation. It was something quieter, more grounded. I saw Genevieve Carter, the woman who refused to be erased. I gathered every piece of evidence, not just Mason's files, but my own service records, testimonials from former commanding officers, letters from soldiers I had led, photographs, medals, everything that told the true story of who I was. But I also gathered something else, perspective. I realized that my fight wasn't only about the house or the inheritance or even my reputation. It was about something far greater. It was about dignity, about truth, about the quiet defiance of refusing to be silenced when the world is pushing you toward it. I could have gone public. I could have shouted from every platform available. Instead, I chose precision. I chose the law. I chose intégrité. I engaged the finest forensic accountants, legal minds, and digital investigators I could find. Every step was deliberate. Every move calculated not to humiliate, but to expose. And throughout all of it, Mason remained beside me. He didn't speak much. He still fumbled for words, still looked away when emotion ran too high. But he stayed. That mattered. The day before the final hearing, I returned to the Monterey house. I walked through each room, trailing my fingers along the walls, listening for echoes of my father's laughter. I sat on the porch as the sun slipped below the horizon, the salt breeze brushing my skin. I was no longer angry, no longer bitter. I was ready. They had waged war on my character, on my memories, on everything I held sacred. But I was finished playing by their rules. I would let the truth speak for itself. And this time I would not flinch. The courtroom felt heavier that morning, not because of the temperature or the marble floors, but because of the pressure pressing down on every breath. There was a density to the silence that stretched between every spoken word, an atmosphere so thick it could have been parted with a blade. I sat at my table, hands laid flat, back straight, eyes ahead. I could hear the soft shuffle of papers, muffled coughs, the hushed murmur of onlookers, but I shut it all out. I had to. Douglas was seated across from me, his lawyer to his left, my mother to his right. They appeared composed on the surface, calm, polished, unbothered. But I could see the small fractures. The tightness in Douglas's jaw, the way his fingers tapped in a rhythm against the table's edge, the way my mother fixed her stare at a point somewhere above the judge's head, as though she couldn't bring herself to meet mine. And then there was Mason. He sat one row behind them, hands folded in his lap, gaze anchored to the floor. Not a word, not a glance, not a signal of allegiance. For a moment, I felt the old ache, the memory of the quiet little boy who used to trail me through the garden, who would tug my sleeve when the others raised their voices, who had once whispered that he wished he could be brave like me. I wondered whether that boy still existed, or whether, like so much else in this family, he had been buried under decades of silence and control. The judge called the session to order. The attorneys rose. The performance began. Douglas's lawyer was polished, every syllable honed to a mirror shine. He spoke of family values, of legitimate inheritance concerns, of irregularities in my military record. He presented charts, timelines, printed exhibits, each engineered to chip away at my credibility, to sow doubt in the judge's mind. I watched without blinking. I had anticipated every maneuver. I had mapped their strategy months earlier from the moment the first notice arrived. My attorney stood composed and precise. She dismantled their arguments piece by piece, never once elevating her voice. She presented my service record, verified and notarized. She entered into evidence commendations, letters from commanding officers, photographs from the field, documents I had never intended to weaponize, now forced into service to defend the life I had built. As the hours wore on and the air in the room grew thinner, Douglas took the stand. I watched, motionless, as he raised his hand, swore his oath, and looked the judge directly in the eye with the same practiced charm he had deployed on business investors for years. He spoke of family loyalty, of erratic behavior, of how I had distanced myself for decades only to surface at the reading of the will. He painted me as volatile, as calculating, as someone who had worn the uniform but never truly earned it. And then he said it, the words that turned my blood cold. She's just a fake veteran. A ripple passed through the room, not loud, but unmistakable. I held my eyes on him, steady, unmoving. But inside, something cracked. My mother was called next. Her testimony was colder and more restrained. She spoke softly, almost with remorse, about her concerns over my mental state, my supposed fabrications, her worry that the inheritance had been improperly influenced. I listened in silence, every word cutting deeper, not merely into the case, but into the memory of the woman who had once kissed my scraped knees and braided my hair. And still Mason said nothing. I let myself glance at him once, only once. His hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was locked. His eyes never lifted. The judge called for a recess. Stepping into the corridor, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. My legs trembled. My throat burned, but I would not let it show. The reporters were waiting. Cameras, microphones, questions I left unanswered. I kept moving, one step at a time, one breath at a time. When the session resumed, I could sense the atmosphere in the room shifting, subtly but perceptibly. The weight of the evidence, the cracks appearing in their story, the quiet unease in the judge's expression as he listened. But nothing was settled yet. I knew we were only in the middle of the battle. The real turning point had not yet come. And Mason remained the unknown. Would he speak? Would he stay silent? Or would he, in the final moment, find the courage to choose truth? I couldn't say, but I was prepared for either outcome. When I think of Mason, I don't think of the man sitting silently in that courtroom. I think of the boy he once was. The boy with the oversized glasses and dog-eared books, whose voice barely rose above a whisper. Mason was always different from Douglas and me. While Douglas pursued approval and control, and I pursued freedom and distance, Mason hid. He was the quiet observer in a family of performers. The only one who never demanded, never competed, never raised his voice. And perhaps that's why I always felt closer to him, even when we were worlds apart. Growing up, I was his protector. I remember the nights he would creep into my room after another argument between our parents and Douglas. His small hands clutching a worn stuffed animal, his eyes wide with confusion. He never asked for much, only the comfort of being noticed, the safety of stillness. But as the years passed, Mason drifted further into the background. He played his part well, the agreeable son, the neutral party. He never challenged our parents, never questioned Douglas, never chose a side. I sometimes wondered if he even knew who he was beneath all the layers of deference and avoidance. That's why in the courtroom, I cannot read him. He sat like a statue, expressionless and detached. Was he still the boy I once knew? Or had he finally chosen comfort over conscience? But the answer had already begun to take shape long before the trial. It had started 2 weeks earlier on a cold and gray afternoon. I was sitting alone on the back porch of the Monterey house when Mason appeared without warning. He stood awkwardly at the top of the wooden steps, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the horizon. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, he said, "I'm sorry." I remember looking at him, truly looking at him, and seeing how depleted he seemed, worn thin by years of being pulled in every direction. "Why are you here, Mason?" I asked, my voice as gentle as the wind. He hesitated, lips pressed together, then parted. "I never wanted to go this far. I thought they'd stop." I swallowed. "They won't stop. You know that." He nodded slowly. Then from his pocket, he withdrew a small flash drive. No words, just the quiet offering of something fragile and dangerous. "What is it?" I asked, my pulse already quickening. "Emails," he said. "Financial records. I found them months ago. I should have come forward sooner." His voice faltered. I took the drive from his trembling hand. It felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. "Mason, why now?" I whispered. He looked away, his eyes glistening. "Because you're the only one who ever stood up for me, even as children, even when you had no reason to. I can't keep pretending. I can't be part of this." For a moment, only the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs filled the air between us. And I saw for the first time the man Mason could have been all along, the one buried beneath fear, beneath loyalty to the wrong people. I wanted to tell him he owed me nothing, but the truth was his decision changed everything. In the courtroom, watching him sit in silence, I knew the war inside him hadn't ended. He was still suspended between two worlds, the family that shaped him and the truth he had finally chosen to defend. That's the nature of betrayal. It doesn't cut in only one direction. Mason had betrayed Douglas and my mother by handing me the means of their downfall. But he had also betrayed the version of himself that had survived by staying quiet for so long. I understood that better than anyone. The night after he gave me the drive, I remained awake reviewing every document. They were devastating. They outlined the full timeline of manipulation, the fraudulent charities, the forged amendments to the will. But beyond that, they revealed intent, a cold, calculated conspiracy that no courtroom could dismiss. Mason had held on to them for months. I could only imagine the nights he had lain awake, those secrets pressing down on his chest. I knew what his choice had cost him. I knew that by standing with me, he would likely lose them, perhaps forever. And so, in that courtroom, when he sat without speaking, I didn't press him. I didn't demand he take the stand or speak aloud. I gave him that stillness, because sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do isn't to declare it out loud. It's to act quietly in the shadow of their own fear. Mason's internal struggle wasn't resolved, but he had made his choice, and now was my turn to carry it forward. There is something deeply unsettling about watching the people you once loved become strangers. Worse, adversaries. As the trial progressed, Douglas's tactics darkened and grew increasingly desperate. He was not content to allow the legal process to run its course. He wanted victory by whatever means necessary. And if that meant destroying me completely, my reputation, my dignity, my sense of self, he would do it without hesitation. The first strike came through the press. Carefully constructed headlines began appearing in local newspapers and online. Questions surfaced over decorated veterans' service claims. Family feud over multi-million-dollar estate raises eyebrows. At first, I dismissed them. I assumed they would fade. They didn't. They multiplied, fueled by anonymous sources who transformed half-truths into character assassination. The language haunted me, emotionally unstable, estranged from family for decades, possible falsification of military service. Each phrase was another chip carved out of the truth I had spent my life living. It was Douglas's signature approach: smear first, deny later. I watched with disbelief as old photographs of me in uniform were picked apart online by armchair critics, some questioning the authenticity of my medals, others doubting the truth of my deployment stories. People who had never met me rendered verdicts on a life they could never comprehend. But it didn't stop there. Douglas had money and influence, and he deployed both. Cleverly fabricated documents began to surface. A forged letter supposedly from my commanding officer casting doubt on my service record. A doctored medical file suggesting I had never been injured overseas. Even a falsified psychological evaluation implying I suffered from delusions. I sat with my legal team reviewing each piece of so-called evidence, my stomach turning at every forged signature, every digital manipulation, every contortion of fact. It was like being erased in real time. The most damaging element, though, wasn't the lies circulating in the press. It was the manipulation occurring inside the family. Douglas had always been my mother's favorite child. Now he weaponized that devotion with surgical precision. I heard accounts of what he told her behind closed doors, that I was dangerous, mentally unstable, that I had returned not to grieve our father, but to seize what wasn't mine. I could see it in her eyes when she passed me in the courthouse corridor, a vacancy where something resembling maternal warmth had once existed. She didn't speak to me. She barely acknowledged me. It was as if I had already been discarded, erased, not by law, but by choice. There's a particular kind of sorrow in realizing your own mother has decided to believe the worst of you. Not because she has proof, but because it is simpler, easier to follow Douglas's version of reality than to confront the possibility that her golden son was capable of deliberate deception. I wrestled with the bitterness each night, lying awake replaying memories from our childhood. Every Christmas morning, every scraped knee she had tended, every lullaby she had hummed. I searched for signs, for anything that might have foretold this moment, and I found nothing. Then there was Mason, who had become the quiet center of the storm. Neither openly defiant nor fully complicit, he drifted in and out of conversations, his face a mask of internal conflict. I knew he was carrying the weight of what he had given me. I could see it was tearing him apart. Douglas noticed too. I watched him lean in during court recesses, whispering to Mason with that practiced smile, touching his shoulder with deliberate care, every gesture calculated. He was reeling Mason back in, playing on guilt, on fear, on the old family script. Loyalty above truth, appearances above integrity. It sickened me, but I knew better than to intervene. Mason had to arrive at his decision on his own terms. If I pushed, I risked losing the only fragile thread of honesty remaining in our bloodline. In the brief, suffocating pauses between testimonies, I caught Mason's eyes across the courtroom. His expression was unreadable, but I recognized the fracture, the slow and inevitable breaking of a person forced to choose between the family that raised him and the truth that could set him free. And still I remained standing. I chose silence not out of weakness, but because I understood that some battles are not decided through volume. They are decided through endurance, through patience, through allowing the truth to rise when the lies finally give way beneath their own weight. Douglas had thrown everything at me. The media, the forged records, the family bonds he had twisted into weapons. And yet I stood, bruised but not shattered. alone but not defeated. And I knew with absolute certainty that the closer we drew to the verdict, the more frantic he would become. The war wasn't finished. Not yet. But the tide was beginning to shift. The night before the final hearing, I sat alone in the Monterey house, watching through the window as waves broke against the rocks below. The air carried salt and memory. My hands rested on the old wooden table where my father used to sit with me, tracing maps of places I would later see with my own eyes while in uniform. This house was more than an inheritance. It was the last intact piece of who I had been before the world, before the family, before the war. I had made my decision long ago. I would not yield. I would not bargain. Whatever Douglas launched at me, however many lies, however thoroughly they distorted my history, I would stand, even if I stood alone. But deep down, I knew I wasn't the only one still undecided. Mason, he held the truth concealed within that flash drive, and yet he had not spoken a single word in court. He had absorbed every accusation, every bitter exchange, every fabricated narrative without lifting his eyes. I had stopped hoping for his testimony. I told myself that whatever he chose, I would accept it. But truthfully, a part of me, the small, fragile piece that still believed in family, waited. Quietly and painfully. It was just past midnight when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find Mason standing there, drenched in mist, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his face pale beneath the porch light. For a moment, we simply regarded each other, neither of us speaking. Then he exhaled, sharp and unsteady, and said, "I can't sleep." I stepped aside. Kumin. He sat in the living room, the same room where we had once built blanket forts as children. His eyes moved slowly across the framed photographs on the mantel. Our family preserved in better years, our father's laughter forever caught behind glass. "I hate him," Mason whispered, barely audible. "I hate what he's done. But she..." He shook his head. "She's still our mother." I lowered myself into the armchair across from him. "I know," he swallowed. "If I testify, she'll never forgive me." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence settle between us, heavy and honest. Finally, I said, "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. Sometimes it isn't about what you lose. It's about what you can carry when it's over." His eyes found mine, then filled with something I hadn't witnessed in years. Raw, unguarded fear. "I don't want to lose you too," he said softly. After everything, after the betrayal and the distance, those words still pierced deeper than any courtroom testimony. "You won't lose me," I said quietly. "Not if you choose the truth." For a long moment, Mason didn't move. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll speak." I exhaled. Not relief, not triumph. Simply release. The understanding that the choice had never been mine to force, but his to make. And he had made it. The following morning, the courtroom felt altered. The tension remained, the exhaustion in every face unchanged, but something subtle had shifted in the atmosphere. Douglas appeared restless, tapping his pen against the table. My mother sat rigid, her expression hewn from ice. When Mason was called to the stand, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he took the oath. I watched him climb those steps. The same man who had spent his entire life evading conflict, now walking directly into its heart. His voice was soft at first, but with each word, each sentence, his steadiness grew. He spoke of the emails, the financial irregularities, the forged documents. He admitted quietly but unmistakably that he had witnessed it all. And he named names. Douglas, our mother. He laid it bare, detail by detail, until the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Something hot stung behind my eyes. I refused to look away. When Mason finished, he didn't look at Douglas. He looked at me. And in that single glance, everything between us, the childhood secrets, the shared loneliness, the long years of unspoken understanding, healed, if only slightly. He had chosen. Douglas's face contorted in barely suppressed rage. My mother's composure cracked for the first time, her mask slipping. But none of that mattered. The line had been crossed. The truth had been spoken. As Mason returned to his seat, he paused beside my chair. He said nothing. He didn't need to. I had not stood alone, after all. And now, with the path cleared and the truth released, I knew this was the moment the tide had turned. The final morning arrived with an unnerving calm, the kind of stillness you only recognize after living through storms. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, my fingers tracing the edges of the tan folder beside me. The same folder that contained everything, every lie, every betrayal, every secret they had never imagined would surface. I could feel Douglas's eyes on me across the room. Sharp, predatory. My mother sat beside him, her expression impenetrable, carved from something colder than stone. And Mason sat behind them, his hands folded in his lap, still but no longer silent. The judge called the session to order. The gavel struck once, the sound reverberating through the room. My attorney rose first, presenting her closing arguments with composed precision. Every word was intentional, every fact stacked with care. Then came the moment. "Your Honor," my attorney said, her voice unwavering. "The defense has repeatedly questioned my client's integrity. Today we present definitive evidence, not only refuting those claims, but exposing an extensive pattern of fraud perpetrated by the plaintiffs themselves." She looked toward me. I rose, taking the folder in my hands. My footsteps felt deliberate, weighted not with fear, but with the full gravity of what I was about to do. As I approached the bench, I caught Mason's gaze for a fraction of a second. He gave his smallest nod. I placed the folder on the judge's desk. Everything that followed moved in slow, surreal motion. The judge adjusted his glasses and turned to the first page. For a moment, there was only the sound of paper sliding between fingertips. His brow furrowed, his expression darkened, and then, in a voice low but carrying through every corner of the room, he spoke words I will never forget. "No one move. Close the doors now." The courtroom gasped. Chairs scraped across the floor. Before anyone could fully absorb what was happening, two uniformed military police officers entered through the side doors, their faces blank, their movements precise and controlled. I didn't move. I had no need to. The judge looked up, his voice rising just enough to reach every person present. "This court is now in possession of evidence suggesting criminal fraud involving federal military benefits, forged legal documents, and obstruction of justice." Douglas's face drained of all color in an instant. His mouth fell open, but no sound emerged. His lawyer, who only hours earlier had stood with such confidence, released every document in his hands. They drifted to the floor like falling leaves. My mother sat frozen, her eyes wide, her lips trembling in silence. She looked not at me, but at the judge, as though the full weight of what was unfolding had finally, at last, begun to reach her. The military police moved methodically, taking up positions at both doors. One officer approached the bench to receive the judge's instructions. The folder was handed over without hesitation. The silence was both unbearable and beautiful. I walked back to my seat without looking at Douglas, without looking at my mother. I kept my gaze forward, hands resting calmly in my lap, the air charged with tension, but my interior perfectly still. I had delivered the truth. The truth was now alive, undeniable, irreversible. The judge called for a brief recess to allow for a preliminary review of the new evidence. The court clerk and bailiffs moved with urgency, their expressions taut. Douglas attempted to rise, perhaps to confer with his attorney, but the military police signaled him to remain seated. I observed the panic, the unraveling, the dawning comprehension on their faces as the world they had so carefully constructed began to fall apart. I had expected to feel triumph. I had anticipated anger, vindication, perhaps relief. I felt none of those things. What I felt was peace. Not because I had won, not yet, but because I had done what I came to do. I had stood my ground. I had told the truth. And now the law would carry the rest forward. Mason sat perfectly still, his face pale, but his eyes locked on mine for the briefest of instants. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The decision he had made, the one that had set this moment into motion, was written across his entire being. When the judge returned, He confirmed that the evidence warranted immediate investigation at the federal level. The civil case would be suspended pending criminal inquiry. Douglas slumped in his seat. My mother shook visibly, and I remained upright. The gavel struck once more. The hearing adjourned. The war was not entirely over, but the battle had been won. I stood, exhaled, and for the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to breathe without fear. The truth has a peculiar way of revealing itself, not always through shouts or dramatic outbursts, but sometimes through quiet, methodical precision. That morning, as the judge returned and the courtroom doors remained firmly sealed under the watch of military police, I knew the unraveling had truly begun. The folder I had placed before him wasn't merely paper and ink. It was a map of deceit, each document a piece of a puzzle that exposed everything Douglas and my mother had so painstakingly assembled. Every forged signature, every manipulated bank transfer, every twisted legal maneuver, all of it laid bare. The judge's voice remained measured, but I could detect the shift beneath it, from civil dispute to criminal exposure. The first revelation emerged through the financial records. Funds supposedly designated for veterans' charities Douglas claimed to support in my name, had been funneled into private accounts linked directly to both him and my mother. Not merely embezzlement, not merely greed, but the exploitation of my military service, the very core of my identity, converted into an instrument for personal gain. I watched as the color receded from Douglas's face. His attorney shuffled through documents that no longer carried any weight. Every fabrication they had labored over was being taken apart in real time. The second revelation cut more deeply. The forensic analysis of my father's will show that the amendments filed in the weeks before his death bore signatures that didn't match those in the original documents. The ink was fresh, the legal language present but hurried, unmistakably manipulated. The amendments had been prepared by an attorney in Douglas's employ, not my father's longtime legal counsel. The judge read the findings without inflection, but the words landed like blows. Forgery, he said, pausing to look over the rims of his glasses. Document tampering, potential conspiracy to defraud. My mother flinched for the first time. Her composure fractured. Her hands trembled. Her eyes darted desperately, searching for something, someone, to ground her. But Douglas kept his gaze fixed ahead, jaw locked, as though sheer resolve could halt the collapse. Then came the final thread. The emails. Those messages were the backbone of everything. Chains of correspondence between Douglas and my mother, discussing the plan to contest the will, to discredit my service, to remove me not only from the inheritance, but from the family entirely. They had spoken casually of my weaknesses, of how no one will believe her because no one ever has. I felt those words somewhere deep inside me, colder than any winter I had ever endured. And yet within that cold, there was a flicker of warmth. Mason. He sat at the witness stand now, hands folded, his voice quiet but unwavering as he answered each question. He confirmed the authenticity of the emails. He described how he had encountered them by accident, how he had struggled with whether to come forward. He acknowledged his fear, his shame, his hesitation. But he came. He made his choice. And for that, I would carry gratitude for the rest of my life. I didn't look at Douglas. I didn't need to. I could feel the fury emanating from him. His plan, months, perhaps years in the making, was disintegrating before his eyes. My mother sat without speaking, without weeping, simply present as her world collapsed around her. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The civil claims against me were dismissed in their entirety. The house, my father's house, was confirmed as rightfully mine. But beyond that, the judge ordered an immediate criminal investigation into both Douglas and my mother for fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of charitable funds. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled. Attorneys exchanged hushed words. I remained still, not from coldness, not from any sense of triumph, but because something deeper had settled within me, a quiet, unshakable certainty that I had done what needed to be done. The truth had unfolded. The lies lay exposed. As the judge adjourned the session, I rose slowly and gathered my things. Mason approached, tentative and uncertain. He stood for a moment in silence, his eyes cast downward. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded, swallowing with difficulty. I should have done it sooner. I offered him the smallest of smiles. "You did it when it mattered." Douglas remained in his seat, motionless, his lawyer leaning in to speak quietly in his ear. My mother sat beside him, her hands twisting together, her expression distant. Neither of them looked at me. Not once. I stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness, the pressure in my chest finally beginning to ease. The fight wasn't over. Legal proceedings would continue. Investigations would follow. But the worst of it, the part where they could determine my story, my name, my life, was finished. The truth was no longer buried. And for the first time in years, I felt free. It's a strange thing, the moment when everything breaks. You imagine it will come with screaming, with fists slammed against surfaces, with chaos too loud to endure. But when it finally happened, when Douglas unraveled right there in the middle of the courtroom, it arrived in silence first. Absolute, suffocating silence. The echo of the judge's gavel barely faded before Douglas stood, unsteady, the smooth arrogance he had carried like armor entirely stripped away. His attorney tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently, but Douglas barely registered it. His eyes swept the room, searching for something he couldn't locate. I remained seated. My hands rested on the polished wood before me. My breathing was even. From the outside, I must have appeared composed, perhaps even victorious. But inwardly, something entirely different was unfolding. Douglas's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "This is wrong," he muttered. "She's lying. She's always been." His words splintered, fell apart mid-sentence. I watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with something heavier. Grief. The man before me wasn't the brother I remembered from childhood, the one who had lifted me onto his shoulders at the county fair, who had taught me how to skip stones across the bay. That version of Douglas had long since ceased to exist, replaced by ambition, by greed, by something colder and beyond my reach. He sank back into his chair. His hands trembled. My mother, our mother, sat frozen beside him, her eyes glassy and her expression unreadable. For the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether she was finally beginning to see the truth or whether she was still holding to the fantasy they had constructed together. And then Mason. He rose from his seat in the gallery, slowly, almost reluctantly. His shoulders shook. His head was bowed, his hands pressed against his face in quiet desperation. I had never seen him cry. Not once. Not even as a child, when bruises and broken hearts had been easier to accumulate than to acknowledge. Now he wept, and something within me fractured. I stood quietly and crossed the floor to meet him, uncertain what impulse drove me there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I simply placed a hand on his shoulder. He pressed his palm to his face, shaking, the full weight of his choice, of the wreckage it had produced, written across every line of his body. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice giving way. I shook my head gently. "You have nothing to be sorry for." His eyes, red and swollen, rose to meet mine. "I broke them," he said. "No," I said softly. "They broke themselves. You just stop pretending not to see it." The bailiffs moved quietly in the background, speaking to Douglas's legal team, escorting my mother to a side room as the paperwork for formal investigation was prepared. None of that occupied my attention in that moment. Not for Mason and me. We stood there, two survivors of the same wreckage, carrying different wounds, yet somehow finding each other in the aftermath. I understood then that I didn't hate Douglas. I didn't even hate my mother. What I carried was something deeper than hatred. It was grief. Grief for the family we might have been, for the years that could never be recovered, for the small, fragile hopes I had held on to far longer than I should have. Mason steadied himself, wiping his face one final time before nodding. He returned to his seat, quieter now, but altered. And I returned to my place, calm, present, but with a heart heavier than I had anticipated. The judge concluded the proceedings, his words reaching me through the roar of feeling filling my chest. Dismissal of claims. initiation of criminal charges, property rights restored. All formal, all necessary. But none of it carried weight in the way people might assume. What mattered was that I had held my ground without losing myself. That I had spoken the truth without resorting to the same cruelty that had been directed at me. What mattered was that Mason had found his voice. The courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters circled outside. Photographers clicked from the courthouse steps. I could hear the distant calls of questions I would never answer. As I passed through the heavy wooden doors, sunlight washed over me, bright, almost too bright after the dim of the courtroom. I didn't look back, because some chapters don't require revisiting. Some endings write themselves not in fire or fury, but in quiet and steady perseverance. And though my heart still ached, though part of it always would, I knew this. I was still standing, and I was free. I had once believed that when the truth came out, everything would settle neatly into place. That justice, once delivered, would stitch together what had been torn apart. I was wrong. The days following the courtroom collapse were quieter than I had expected. Eerily so. Douglas disappeared from public view. My mother retreated into silence as well. Her calls unanswered, her name left unspoken. The once prominent Carter family, whose name had graced hotel lobbies and charity galas, had become a ghost, a ruin. But it wasn't the public reaction that unsettled me. It was Mason. He occupied a kind of middle ground, neither fully at my side nor condemned alongside them. I could see it in his eyes one afternoon when he came to the house. Hands in his pockets, shoulders curled under a weight even he couldn't name. "They won't speak to me," he said quietly, barely above a breath. "Not even Mom." I poured him tea. "They say I betrayed them, that I destroyed the family." I keep thinking, maybe I did. I set down the cup and held his gaze. "You didn't destroy anything, Mason. They did that themselves." But I understood that the guilt inside him wasn't something words could heal. The lines on his face had deepened. The air around him was heavy with regret. Even though he had chosen truth, the price of that choice was steep, and it showed in every movement he made. Some people would call him courageous. Others would say he had waited too long, that he had only spoken when it was safe to do so. I knew the whispers were already starting, online, in hushed conversations, in the sideways glances we received around town. Was Mason truly innocent, or had he simply switched sides when it was advantageous? The question drifted unspoken between us, and though I never doubted his heart, I couldn't dismiss the complexity of what he had done or failed to do for so many years. I didn't press him for answers. I understood something most people never would. In a family like ours, survival had often meant silence. Breaking that silence demanded not just courage, but sacrifice. As the sun sank lower over the cliffs, we sat together without speaking. No forgiveness offered, none required. Just two people doing their best to make sense of the fragments that remained. And somehow, that had to be enough. I had thought the hardest part would be the fight itself. The trial, the lies, the public exposure. I was wrong. The hardest part came afterward. When the noise fell away and all that remained was the hollow ache of everything we had lost. I spent hours walking the shoreline behind the Monterey house, tracing the waterline the way I had as a child. The same waves that had once felt so boundless, so full of promise, now carried the quiet weight of memory and regret. I thought about my father, how he had loved this place, how he had believed, naively, that the family he built would hold together after he was gone. I wondered what he would make of us now. Fractured, divided, hollowed out by greed and betrayal. I thought about my mother, the way she had looked through me in court, the way her voice had never wavered as she stood against me. I had spent so many years reaching for her approval, her warmth, her pride. But at some point, I had stopped asking. And then there was Douglas, the brother I had once admired, then feared, then finally come to pity. I no longer hated him. Somewhere in the wreckage of everything we had been through, I had let that go. Because hatred is a burden. It corrodes from within. And after carrying it for too long, I was simply tired. Somewhere along the way, I had come to understand that releasing that hatred wasn't weakness. It was survival. I couldn't undo what had been done. I couldn't summon apologies that would never come. But I could choose what to carry forward. And I chose this. I chose to forgive. Not because they had earned it, but because I had. I chose to stop pursuing what had never truly been available to me. Their love, their validation, their acceptance. I chose to stand alone if that was the cost of finally being free. As the tide drew back toward the horizon, something shifted inside me. Not joy, not relief, but something more grounded. The quiet resolve of someone who has walked through fire and come through whole. Not untouched, but whole. And sometimes that is enough. The public has a short memory. 4 weeks after the trial, my name was everywhere. Local news, online forums, podcasts dissecting the Carter family scandal with all the nuance of a tabloid headline. Some call me a hero. Others call me a fraud who had somehow gotten lucky. A few questioned whether the entire case had been orchestrated for sympathy or financial advantage. The pendulum swung. Praise, doubt, outrage, admiration. None of it mattered. Not truly, because the truth, the real truth, was that I no longer needed their approval. I wasn't the villain Douglas had tried to manufacture, but I wasn't the hero the headlines attempted to construct either. I was something far more complicated, far more human. A woman who had made mistakes, who had carried wounds both visible and concealed, who had fought for something that could never be entirely restored. My military record was cleared. The false accusations were formally withdrawn. I received quiet apologies from some who had once looked the other way. But the deeper damage couldn't be undone. I wasn't angry about it. I wasn't bitter. I had simply moved beyond it. I attended one public event, a veterans charity gala months later. The applause was polite. The handshakes were genuine, but I could still feel it, the undercurrent of curiosity, of discomfort, as though people didn't quite know what to make of me. And that was fine because I wasn't there for them. I was there for the ones who would never get to tell their stories. The ones who had come home in pieces, physically and emotionally, whose truths would never make headlines. I was there for myself. The Monterey house became my sanctuary. I restored the garden my father had once tended. I began volunteering quietly at a local outreach center for veterans. I stopped following the news. I stopped explaining myself. I lived not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who had finally, at last, claimed the right to define herself. And in the end, that was the victory no one could ever take from me. The house by the sea has always been my anchor. After the trial, after the headlines receded and the legal proceedings settled into the distant background, I came home, not to family, not to applause, but to the one place that had never betrayed me. The Monterey house stood exactly as I remembered it. Weathered wood, windows streaked with salt, the garden overgrown but still alive beneath years of neglect. I spent my first morning there in silence, my fingertips brushing old furniture, listening to the wind carry memories through half-open doors. I didn't rush to fill the space. I let it remain simple, bare, honest. I began tending the garden again, slowly, patiently, hands in the soil, knees pressed to the earth. And there I found something I hadn't realized I had been missing. Stillness. The kind that doesn't demand answers. The kind that allows you simply to exist. I filled pages with stories I had carried for decades. Some from distant battlefields, some from quiet childhood afternoons. I didn't write for publication. I wrote for the woman I had become, for the girl I had once been, for the life I was still piecing together. Mason visited sometimes. He never stayed long. He never said much. But when he came, we sat on the porch with coffee, watching the sun descend below the water, the sky bleeding gold and violet. We didn't speak about the trial or the family or the things we had lost. Instead, we talked about music, about the books he was reading, about the small things that somehow feel like everything when the world finally slows down enough to notice. I forgave him without words, through presence. And he, in his own quiet way, forgave me too. For the distance, for the years we had each let slip away. I learned to live without the noise of the past. I learned that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in soft and hesitant, like sunlight through cracked glass. And most of all, I learned that sometimes peace isn't something you find. Sometimes it's something you build, one breath, one decision, one moment at a time. It took me longer than I care to acknowledge to understand that survival wasn't the end of my story. For so long, I had believed that enduring the courtroom battles, the betrayals, the heartbreak was the finish line. But as the weeks stretched into months, I came to see that endings aren't always sharp. Sometimes they dissolve into beginnings so quiet you barely notice them happening. I stopped counting the days since the verdict. I stopped measuring my life by what I had lost. Instead, I started planting roses. At first it felt trivial, even strange. But as the first buds emerged, soft pinks, deep reds, I found something gentle in myself that I had believed long extinguished. It wasn't only about the flowers. It was about nurturing something fragile, something living. I began waking with the sunrise. I began sleeping without nightmares. The weight in my chest lightened, not gone, but softer, more bearable. Mason continued to visit. The distance between us narrowed, not through grand confessions or sweeping reconciliations, but through the simple act of showing up. He helped me build a new fence. He brought seeds for the garden. Sometimes we sat for hours without speaking, and somehow those silences healed more than any words could have. I didn't pursue forgiveness from Douglas or my mother. I didn't seek explanations I knew would never arrive. I allowed them to remain as ghosts in my story, present but no longer shaping it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't anyone's failure. I wasn't anyone's scapegoat. I was simply myself. I found myself in the sound of the waves, in the pages of half-finished manuscripts, in the fragrance of lavender on the sea breeze. I learned to love the quiet. I learned to find meaning without struggle. I wasn't the hero people wanted me to be. I wasn't the villain others had painted. I was simply a woman who had survived, who had chosen not to let bitterness take root, who, when given every reason to despise, had chosen instead to begin again. And for me, that was more than enough. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Not just for listening, but for witnessing, for sitting beside me through the darkness, through the fire, through the quiet spaces in between. This isn't a story about victory in the way most people understand it. It isn't about winning or proving something to the world. It's about reclaiming what was always mine, my dignity, my name, my peace. It's about the long, slow work of getting back on your feet after being knocked down, not once but again and again. It's about learning that forgiveness isn't always something you extend to others. Sometimes it's something you grant to yourself. We live in a world that is quick to judge, quick to abandon, quick to transform pain into spectacle. I know that better than most. But I also know this. There is power in telling the truth. There is power in surviving. And there is immense power in choosing to begin again, without hatred, without bitterness, without any need for revenge. I don't know what battles you're fighting. I don't know what wounds you carry, but I know you're still here. And sometimes, that is the most courageous thing of all. If this story stirred something within you, I hope you'll carry it with you. Share it. Hold space for the people in your life who need to hear that broken does not mean defeated. And if you ever need a reminder, you are not what others say about you. You are not the worst thing that has ever happened to you. You are worthy of starting over, of peace, of joy, of coming home to yourself. Thank you for being part of this journey. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read every one of them with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this one, but to become part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story forward. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive at your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.